record. This week's Torah portion is Parashat Vayashev. For some reason, I really like this. There's something about when this parsha comes around this time of year that like makes me feel very nostalgic, even though like I don't find Joseph a very compelling character on his own. Like I think he's kind of a brat, but it's like that it comes around this Hanukkah and that like I don't know, that it's a very familiar story from childhood, right? It's like one of the early ones that we teach kids, that it just like, it makes me feel like the holidays are coming. It's really winter now. It's Parashat Vayashev. I don't know. So it's the beginning of the Joseph narrative. It starts with the family settling in Canaan. Rachel is already dead, and we are told that Jacob favors Joseph, and Joseph's brothers are jealous. Joseph, of course, does not help matters. He shows off his multicolored coat. He tells the brothers of his dreams of like that one day they will all bow down to him. Things aren't going so well. So one day, Joseph goes looking for his brothers while they are tending flocks, and they are plotting to kill him. And as he approaches, they decide at the last minute to cast him into a pit instead. Reuben is the architect of that shift because he plans to save him later. Then in the meantime, Judah sells Joseph into slavery instead. So Joseph is taken as a slave to Potiphar. Things are going pretty well for Joseph in Potiphar's house, as well as they can be as a slave, but like Potiphar likes him, he's good at his job, he's promoted very quickly to head slave, I don't know. And then Potiphar's wife does this kind of strange thing where she like comes on to him and he rejects her. So then she accuses him of assaulting her. And he is thrown into jail. Meanwhile, while all this is happening, there's also another little side tale, which is sort of how we saw the story of Dinah in last week's Parsha, where there's all this goings on with the brothers, and then like, oh, by the way, this is also happening with his sister. So in this week's Parsha, all this is happening with Joseph, and then we get this like flashback to Canaan, and Judah's sons keep dying. So he refuses to give another one to his daughter-in-law, even though that's like the custom of the time, is if a man dies without producing an heir, the wife marries the next brother. And Judah refuses to give her another one. So she dresses up as a prostitute and puts herself in like his view. I don't know how to say it. Like she architects this, but he also makes the choice to pay her for sex. So like that's on him. And then so she produces an heir to the Israelite line that way. And that child ends up being in the line of, I can't remember how many generations we're at now, but he's like the grandfather of Boaz, who comes again in the Ruth story, and who is the grandfather of King David. So, just as we say, like, oh, Ruth is a Moabite, she shouldn't have been allowed to marry in at all, but then she becomes the grandmother of the great King David. This is sort of that same thing where like Tamar is considered like a black widow, her husbands keep dying and she like tricks her father-in-law, but that child becomes a very important like part of the lineage of the Jewish people. So then we switch back to Joseph, and he's in jail now, and while in jail, two other men are thrown into jail with him, and he interprets their dreams and they come true. So that sets him up. Then it cuts off there. We don't know what happens next, but of course we read this story every year, so we know that because of that, word is going to get to Pharaoh and things are going to turn, get a lot better for Joseph. But it cuts off with the butler getting out of jail, and Joseph is left to rot still in jail. So that's the summary. There's a lot there. Does anyone have questions or pieces of the text they want to start on? Yeah, Hava.
So Joseph's ornamented tunic, I think there's a lot of stories that go along with that.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of times it's portrayed as a rainbow.
Yeah.
And I didn't know if that was like somehow in some groups construed as like LGBT pride type of thing.
I mean, obviously that's very anachronistic for Joseph, but yes, it has been construed that way. There's a book called Torah Queries, like with an extra E, so not just queries like inquisitions, but like queer people. And so it's a series of Divrei Torah written by and about LGBT, written by LGBT authors, sort of looking at Torah through that lens. And so one of them does posit that Joseph is gay, not just because like his coat might have been rainbow, which again, like, I mean, that's a pretty modern association, but because like he's so vain and he's so pretty and he's so clean, and even when he's a slave, like he's so, well put together, and then he refuses advances. So they kind of allude to that. And so this book is like 15 years old now. So I've also then seen the criticism of like, men can be clean, doesn't mean he's gay. Like some gay men are slovenly too. Like, we don't need to play into stereotypes here. But it kind of depends on, I think, what stage of representation, like what stage of societal acceptance we're at, when you get to see plenty of representation, relying on stereotypes doesn't feel fun anymore. But 15 years ago, maybe, like when people were more desperate to see themselves in Jewish public life, then that was a fun way to read the text.
Rabbi, you said you like this because it reminds you of all the holidays coming up and everything. I find it interesting because it really depicts families, especially bigger families. Being the mother of 4 sons, and you might as well, not that my kids have tried to kill any of their siblings, but you could see the sibling rivalry and how they try and deal with it, and I think some of this happening there, So.
Exactly. Yeah, that's another reason that it feels very like holiday related to me, like all that family coming together. Especially like, so Joseph is still kind of young when he's sold into slavery, but some of the brothers are grown adults, and like, so managing, like they've got families of their own, but they're still at home. And like, you think about that as like multi-generational families come back together in the family home for Thanksgiving or whatever, and all the angst that goes with that, and the the way things,
we can't talk politics, we can't talk religion, we can't.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So we can, or somebody goes away, with their feelings hurt or
Right.
or whatever. Also about the code, I don't know that, I'm thinking maybe it wasn't as grand as we're thinking. that the brothers just thought it was better than anything they had, and more of I see it more from, their perspective, perhaps as being jealous as rather than being something off the charts here.
Well, it's probably somewhere in between, right? Because the fact is that dye was expensive, and most people, you wore like colors in the natural color of the spun linen or the wool or whatever. Like, so the fact that Jacob would go to the effort of dyeing this tunic in more than one color, like multicolored, it could be two. I mean, we don't know, but that fact that he did it at all was a grand gesture in itself, and it maybe wasn't as stunning to the eye as we imagine it, but it was, it was more than was necessary. So in that time and place, like anything that was more than is necessary was a lot. Yeah, David.
Kind of related, but not the same. I don't remember exactly where it was, but Joseph has been out in the fields with his brothers, and he comes back and he spreads evil rumors or evil tidings or gives a bad report, but he used the word hurrah.
Yeah.
Did I read that correctly? Does that mean that he was reporting things they did that were bad, or he's guilty of spreading false rumors that this is coming from a Yetzer Hara?
I'm trying to find the
Get them in trouble.
line, but I do believe, so certainly the traditional explanation is that he brings news of their evil doings to their father.
It's 37 verse 2.
Yeah, okay, there we go. It's right at the beginning. Bad words. So I think, so the traditional commentary, right? Like, because the rabbis always want to give benefit of the doubt to our lineage person, and to do whatever they can to denigrate like the ones that aren't the main focus of the Torah, right? Because whoever God favors is favored for a reason. So that's the traditional reading, is that the brothers were behaving inappropriately, and Joseph brings the report back.
So
What?
he's tattletelling.
He's tattletaling, yes. Although we don't know for sure what it means. Rashi says it could be gossip, but that whatever he could speak bad about them, he told to his father. So that it was still, he wasn't making things up. He was maybe tattletaling, maybe exaggerating, but he wasn't, he wasn't inventing bad things.
Okay.
But that's still Lashon Hara, right? Like in the traditional value, the Musar sense is like, even if it's true, you don't talk about people behind their back. So.
I can't remember whose son is Joseph.
Rachel. Rachel has two of her own, Joseph and Benjamin.
And is that part of the reason?
Yes.
He's Isaac's favorite. I mean, Jacob's favorite.
Yeah, absolutely. And we see too later when the famine starts and they send the brothers to Egypt, Jacob sends the living sons, I think Jacob said, to Egypt to get food, and he won't send Benjamin with them. And you could make the argument, like at the outset, because Benjamin's the youngest and maybe he's just not old enough to travel without parental guardianship. But the brothers tell Joseph, and they don't know it's Joseph, but Joseph says, like, is this all of your whole family? And they say, no, we have another brother, but he does not come because he is the only living sibling of his beloved mother, and our father would surely, die if something happened to him. Like, they make very clear that they know that Rachel's kids are his favorites, and they've already lost one on him, and it nearly killed him, and they cannot lose the other one. They've like learned their lesson a little bit, but there's still something kind of painful about that to me, that they recognize that now Joseph's gone and Benjamin's the favorite. It like didn't do them any good to get rid of Joseph, because the problem wasn't really Joseph, it was Rachel, or it was like Jacob. I mean, really, but you know. Although I don't think Joseph helped matters, because he was kind of a brat, but
Yeah. It does strike me. So if he had these dreams, the sun and the stars, and it does sound like such bravado and bragging, and you could keep it to yourself.
or tell your father without telling all of your big brothers that like someday you will bow down to me. Like, there are ways to say, I think I'm having these dreams of the future, to your father, who's also had, semi-prophetic dreams, which
Right.
maybe he doesn't know that, but
They are kind of similar, Jacob and Joseph, because they were both dreamers. Esau wanted to kill Jacob. The brothers want to kill Joseph.
they're both kind of homebodies,
Yep.
right? It says Joseph tends the flocks with, he tended the flocks with his brother, but he was a helper to the sons of his father's wives. I don't know. There's something about that. Bilhah and Zilpah, there's something about, they're the younger ones, right? Like Leah had the first 3 or 4 children. So that says to me that he's closer to home. The brothers are off on the far hill, and he has to go looking for them, when they're plotting his death. I think he stays closer to home like Jacob did. Which might also be another reason that Jacob favors him. Or it could be, that's the nature versus nurture, right? Like, does Jacob favor him because he sees himself in Joseph? Or does Joseph mirror Jacob more because Jacob dotes on him?
I think it said also that Joseph like gave him a tunic, like he made him a tunic, like he made him a gift.
Yeah.
So Joseph is taking care of Jacob.
No, the other way around. Jacob made Joseph a tunic. Yeah.
Yeah, but is it a reward for what he helps the father do around the house, around the home?
We're not given any indication of that.
Yeah. Just that he's his father. His favorite.
His favorite.
Why didn't Benjamin get them?
I always wondered that too. I think, so this happens in the text, it happens after Rachel's gone, but Benjamin's not mentioned in like any of this chapter at all, or this parsha at all. So, sometimes the chronology in the Torah gets kind of flippy floppy. So I've always kind of thought that Benjamin's not born yet. That it's possible Joseph was sent away before Rachel's dead.
Okay, because it says Jacob was settled in the land where his father had sojourned, the land of Canaan.
Yeah,
So it sounds like he's already arrived.
I guess that's true.
But maybe there's a little resentment because Benjamin killed Rachel.
Right.
And maybe he's just too young to be involved. I mean, if Joseph is 17 and Benjamin's younger than that, he's too young to be involved in this sort of a grown-up story.
Too young to need real clothes yet, so he doesn't get a multicolored tunic.
Not that, but too young to be a pain in the butt to his brothers, to his oldest brothers. They might not have anything to do with that, kid. He maybe be 5 or 6 or whatever. And they just ignore him.
Also, I've heard this saying that, like a child is their mother's child until they're like 6, and then they become their father's child, because, once they can follow dad around, particularly perhaps if they're boys, then that's what they do.
Hey, let us know in 2 years if that happens. Or 3 years. How old is Braden?
He's 3.5.
Okay.
I do have to say that reading all of this, and they're breaking all these laws, rules, but do they have the rules yet?
No.
No.
Well, they have some rules. They know not to kill somebody.
Right.
They've got the rules set up by Noah.
Yeah, the
Okay.
Noahide laws
All right.
do
So-
include not tearing an animal limb from limb the way, I guess
Right.
it's not super clear when they do it. Hold on, let me find that line. When they slaughtered a kid and dipped the tunic in its blood. It's vague, but that feels like.
Yes. So there's some rule, although I had the sense they dipped it in the blood so it would look like he was killed.
Well,
Not
yeah.
'cause it was-
Yeah.
Not because it was a degradation.
Right.
But anyway, it made me think, why didn't God just give the laws to Abraham?
Because there's like a training process, so it's
Okay.
like the covenant with Abraham. This is how it's often described, right? Because the Jewish people are married to God. So the covenant with Abraham is the betrothal, or the engagement, and then the covenant on Sinai is the marriage. So there's a time of like learning each other and committing and like preparing. And when you marry an eternal person, an eternal being, sorry, not a person, an eternal being, you need 100 generations instead of a year. Or 10 in my case, I guess, but yeah.
The other thing is that I think Abraham would have been too rigid, where Moses could be angry and break the 10 commandments, but he's also able to go and intercede for the people of Israel with God. Whereas my guess on that with Abraham is he would have called for a plague on everybody, just wipe them out, because he seemed to me to be, as a personality, more rigid, notwithstanding his willingness to argue with God about Sodom and Gomorrah. But I can't see Abraham in the same role as Moses, say.
Yeah, I agree.
I agree with you that I think it takes time for people to move their heads around. I mean, even in Jacob's time, he had to go and take the idols and bury them before they could leave the area. So
Right.
idols, where'd those come from? Well, from his in-laws' houses. Just people weren't, yeah, we believe in God, but gonna hedge our bets a little bit,
Right.
We want to keep this I don't want to piss off a family idol, house might fall in. And that transition, to me, it's to go from something physical that you can see to something that you are claiming has no body at all,
Right.
no reality, and yet is the ultimate reality. That's a major mental shift that I'm really, if I'm
And
in
that there's
awe,
only
I think
one.
that's what I'm in awe of.
The shift from many to one was a huge difficulty.
As well.
Yeah, so it takes time for that idea to take root. And I think part of it taking root is just reaching critical mass of the family, right? Like by the time they leave Egypt and settle in the land of Israel, like spreading this belief or establishing it as the belief of the kingdom, which they still don't do very effectively. I mean, there's still idol worship in the kingdom of Israel, but like the group that leaves Egypt is all still just descendants of these same 12 brothers. So, there's not, it's not like the message spread organically, really. So to have a nation that's going to adhere to these laws, you need to create the nation first. We don't proselytize. Yeah. Other parts of the text that strike you? Yeah, David.
Tell us about Tamar and
Yeah.
and Judah and what it's doing in the middle of the Joseph story.
Yeah, I was wondering about that too.
I was reading along, and I've read it before, but it still came as kind of a shock. I was thinking, what? Wait a minute. We should be moving into Egypt, and now where? So what's it doing?
Yep.
Why?
It's a complete chapter, so probably it's not supposed to be right here, or like it was, maybe the different tribes had their own sort of historical oral narratives that had to be fused together, and we were like, well, this is happening simultaneously. How do we insert it in one national oral story, or written story, depending on when it fused together like this? So this is where they stuck it. But the fact that it's a full, because sometimes texts do, like the Torah will sort of try to tell multiple stories at once, and it could happen in the same chapter, and it would say like, after these things, like, the Elah Devarim, like it sometimes it gives us that kind of preface. The fact that it doesn't here, and that it's such its own like chunk, it does say about that time, but I think it was a separate piece of narrative that got woven together.
Why did the rabbis then decide, whatever group decided what stays in the Torah and where it goes? Why do you think they put it right there in the Joseph story? Is there a purpose that the rabbis say this is why it's here, or it's just one of the things we accept?
I don't know. Let's see. Ibn Ezra says, the Bible placed this chapter here to contrast the behavior of Joseph vis-a-vis his master's wife with that of Judah toward his daughter-in-law. What forced me to offer this interpretation is the fact that only 22 years passed between the sale of Joseph and the descent of our ancestors into Egypt. Now we learn in this chapter, the birth of Onan. I clicked on something. What happened here? Okay, the birth of Onan, Judah's second son, and his reaching the age of procreation, which at the very earliest starts at the age of 12. Scripture then goes on to state, in the process of time. So that the chapter tells us that Tamar conceived and gave birth to Perez in this time, because then Perez came to Egypt with 2 of his sons of his own when the brothers descend in 22 years. So,
Oh, okay, so that's the
so that
time.
Ibn Ezra is kind of saying both, that on the one hand, it does kind of happen simultaneously in the timeline, but more importantly, they wanted to put it right next to the Potiphar's wife narrative with Joseph.
And again, there's like sibling rivalry here.
Hmm.
He doesn't want to provide offspring for his brother. And then Tamar
Well,
has,
Judah, it's his sons
it's his son, right?
that he thinks there's something wrong with Tamar, that his sons keep dying after laying with her. So he
Oh,
doesn't want to give the third one.
it says, but Onan, knowing that the seed would not count as his, let it go to waste.
Oh, that one. Yeah,
Not to
okay,
provide
right.
offspring for his brother. And then she has twins again. And there's some discrepancy about which one is really born first. Because one puts his hand out and then draws it back. And then the other brother comes out first. I don't know how they know all that. But
They tied a
that-
string on it, on his
Oh,
hand.
right. That's right. And so that's the end of chapter 38. It's like from
Oh, whose hand was
20
up.
27 to the end of 38.
That's so funny. I didn't really take note of that. What quick thinking for the midwife? Why would that be? Well, wouldn't you grab and pull? I don't know.
Again, because the firstborn has
Has rights. Yeah.
rights that the secondborn doesn't have. So she had to make sure once they were both out, she knew who was who. She
So
put the
Perez,
twins-
and unlike in a lot of other situations where then the second does subvert that rule, Perez is the one that becomes the, like I said, he's the grandfather, I think, of Boaz, who is the grandfather of King David.
So
Okay.
are they the same line?
So it's the same line. I lose track of the generations because there's not stories about the people in between. Like, we don't really know about Perez's son or Boaz's father. We don't really know. Jesse, for some reason, his name sticks in my mind, I guess because it's it's still a current name. Jesse is David's father, is the one that, but anyway, I don't know. We don't get stories about them, so I lose track. But Perez is definitely the direct line to David. King David, yeah.
Okay. Well, and he definitely came out.
And he's, yeah.
His whole body was born before his brothers.
Oh, wait, you're right. Perez is out came his brother. Zerach is the one with the crimson. Oh, so yeah, so it does still subvert.
Right.
That's interesting. It's a good, I mean, people will point to this. Judah is, he wants to do right. You know, like, he is worried about his son's life. That's why he doesn't give the third one. He owns up to it immediately when Tamar produces his staff. He says that she is more righteous than I am. But I don't know. It's still.
He also is the one who intercedes and says, let's not kill Joseph, we'll just sell him.
That's true too.
So he is trying to do the right thing.
And people will point to that as well. And of course, the tribe of Judah is the last remaining one that doesn't like fully assimilate in Babylonia, and that's why in the diaspora we come to be known as Jews instead of Hebrews or tribes of Israel, because we all ostensibly are from Judah. And then, no, sorry. So do other questions? So one thing that always sticks out to me, back toward the beginning, one time his fathers had gone to pasture their father's flock at Shechem. Like, also, why did they go back to Shechem? They murdered everybody there. They ran away from there. Why are they pasturing their flocks back there? And Israel says to Joseph, your brothers are pasturing at Shechem. I will send you to them. And he said, and Joseph said to him, Hineni, which is like, we know that that's a powerful, it doesn't just mean, you know, the translation on Safari says, I am ready. Most commonly, here I am. But it's like a very bold, you know, usually when it's used, it's like this fully spiritual, all of me is here and going to do a big thing. But like, it does kind of turn out to be a big moment for Joseph because it's when he's attacked and sold. But like, does he know that? Does Jacob know that? Like, what is he saying I am ready for in this moment? And then, so he goes, also from the valley of Hebron to Shechem. I mean, Israel's not such a big country, but like, they're not next to each other. It's like a good, I don't know, I'm not great at like estimating space, but like Hebron is kind of in the south of the West Bank. And Shechem is, they say, is where Nablus is now, which is kind of in the north, like it's north of Jerusalem. So we're talking like a good 30 miles to just walk over and see how they're doing and come back. I don't know. There's some weird details happening here.
It does sound like he knows.
Like Jacob knows something.
Knows that he's, yeah, that he's,
Yeah,
that his brothers aren't going to welcome him gladly.
yeah, something weird is happening. A man came upon him wandering in the fields. Also, was Joseph lost, like because it was so far? And the man who is this man? The man asked him, "What are you looking for?" "I'm looking for my brothers. Could you tell me where they are pasturing?" The man said, "They have gone from here, for I heard them say, 'Let us go to Dothan.'" So Joseph followed his brothers and found them at Dothan. Who is this man, and how did he know who Joseph was and who his brothers were? You know, like, there's so much missing in these 4 verses that I just find fascinating. Like, the choice of what the Torah chooses to include and exclude is interesting, because they could also, I mean, the Torah is very terse. It wouldn't be notable, the details that are missing, if it simply said Jacob sent Joseph to check on his brothers and Joseph went, and like, that was it. We might comment on like that's kind of a long distance to go by himself. Why didn't he go with his other brothers to begin with? I don't know. Like, there could be some gaps still there, but that would be very in line with the succinctity, whatever that word is, succinction of the Torah. But the that this like bit about the man, I don't know, there's like enough extra detail here that does make it really notable how much detail is missing, I think. And I'm just wondering what you all think about that.
This part reminds me of like in modern times, like a dad telling his elementary school age child, like, yes, you can walk to school by yourself. And he lets the kid think that he's doing it by himself. And then he follows him and makes sure he gets there safely.
Yeah. So Rashi says that the man is the angel Gabriel. So like, yeah, maybe Jacob says, oh yeah, you can go by yourself. Hey, God, go check on him for me.
Maybe he doesn't even have to ask God.
Right.
God's already knows what's going to happen. So he just makes sure he gets to his right place to fulfill the prophecy of what's going to happen to him. Because the story otherwise doesn't go forward.
That's true.
If Jacob doesn't end up in Egypt,
Joseph.
Yeah.
so it's a literary.
Yes, for sure. And Joseph says that himself. I mean, he doesn't say it was a literary trope, but he says himself when the brothers are reunited in a couple weeks, he says, like, you know, if you hadn't attacked me and sold me into slavery, I wouldn't have ended up in this place and we would all be dead of starvation. So, like, it, you know, it is all part of God's plan, which, like, is a kind of a troubling theology in a lot of ways, but it works for this one story. And it's nice that Joseph feels that way. I was listening to a podcast, I know, shocker, right? That, and the host was saying something about, like, it's important to find ways to, like, synthesize trauma into your being and, like, move on from it. But that she's wary of the language that people sometimes try to use of, like, making meaning out of, because then it feels like we're accepting the value of trauma, and we don't want to do that either, because, like, nobody deserves to be traumatized. And so, like, it's fine for someone to, I don't know, learn an important lesson about themselves in that process, but to this kind of Joseph narrative of, like, it was for the best because it led to this, is like,
Really?
you know,
Like when people try to tell you how to feel after a big loss.
right.
It's for the
It's all part
best.
of
They're in a
God's
better-
plan.
They're in a better place.
Yeah.
Time will heal.
I know I'm getting a little ahead, but the fact that they were starving from the famine and everything, was that climate related? Were we already screwing around with the planet back then?
It's possible, but probably not if it's preceded by 7 years of plenty. Sometimes, I mean, some cycles of this stuff, I mean, it's natural to some extent. A lot of,
Yeah. Okay, so did the people not properly plan for
that's entirely
the
possible.
time when there, wasn't going to be plenty?
Yeah, I think that's
I don't know
entirely
enough.
possible. For sure, like, I think when you, especially for 7 years, right? Like, you might start to think that this is just normal, right? If there's a bigger crop 1 year, and then it doesn't happen again the next year, and then it happens again and get in some time in the future, you might think, like, oh, we didn't capitalize on it correctly the last time this happened, let's do it now. But if it's 7 years in a row, you might start just to think, like, this is normal, and I'm gonna really, like, enjoy every last drop of it, and I'm gonna over harvest and over farm, and we don't have Shemitah laws yet, So like the importance of crop rotation and letting the soil regenerate is not, not happening in Egypt as far as I know. I don't really know much about ancient Egyptian agriculture, but like there certainly could be something to that of like they had one really good year or two, maybe two in a row to begin with that was just kind of natural, and they were like, yeah, and just went like too hard. And then after 7 years of that, the land just kind of was like, nope, I'm done. And it's presented in the Torah as like very even, right? 7 years of plenty, 7 years of famine. And if, we also don't know how much of this is true to the word, like where the line is, but I would think like probably more likely is that, yeah, there was years of building to a peak of overabundance and then a drop off that, was not as severe. Like 1 year, there just was nothing for 7 years, but that like each subsequent year, there was less and less significantly.
And is this where the law comes from to let your fields rest after 7 years?
It's not attributed directly to this, but like, because the reasoning in Leviticus when we get those rules is more like, or Deuteronomy is more like, just like you get a rest every 7 days. Well, the land is, has a longer lifespan. So what is a day's rest in a week for the land? But that every 7 years it gets a Shabbat as well. So it comes from that. But I think like there's an allusion or a foreshadowing maybe happening in this story of those cycles of 7, right? That's a very like magic number in the Torah.
Just wondering.
And like, so there's a funny, this is coming right out of my head right now, so I don't know if there's midrash on this, and that I'm not big on gematria because I don't do math, but the root word for sitting, like Vayashev, is like, and we settled, we sat down, or he, it's not we, he is the pronoun in that word, but shev is sit, but 7 is sheva, right? So like the process of shiva is both you are sitting for 7 days, like it's a combination of those two things, and like that's partially just coincidence of the way the language that those words are closely related, but since we're talking about these cycles of 7, it's interesting to think that also like this parsha, I know the cycles of 7 come up in a later parsha, but we're talking about it now, and this parsha is called Vayashev, and those words are connected in Hebrew. Any last thoughts? Oh, sorry, go ahead,
Is there
Michelle.
any commentary throughout the writing of the Torah about the grammar or the fact that it's all in the masculine most of the time, or?
There's a lot of different things to that. So Ibn Ezra and Nachmanides are both ancient or medieval commentators that talk a lot about grammar. They love finding particular meaning in what are probably like scribal errors, like every time something is spelled differently than usual, or there's like a pause here, which again, like that, some of that's later additions when the vocalization, the vowels, and the trope are added. But it was still enough of an accepted tradition by the time they were writing that they were like, that they would comment on things like that, on the grammar structure itself and what that comes to teach us in ways that I find very interesting. It's not something that like, if I wasn't reading them, like I would never, my grammatical structure of biblical Hebrew is not that close. Like, I don't know. But so it's interesting when they do that. They don't comment on the masculine because it's a given for them. So a lot of that just is like, you know, ancient patriarchy, that was part of. Maimonides touches on it a tiny, like, kind of roundabout in how Maimonides talks about that God, you know, is not a person, does not have a body, does not have a gender, but that, like, the default person or the default pronoun is just masculine, but that's like just the way it was. So the Hebrew, which is a very gendered language, like a lot of languages really are gendered, it just kind of went to that when the Israelites introduced this monotheistic God. Like previously, all pantheons really existed in pairs. Almost every god had a counter goddess, or, you know, a partner, especially the head of the pantheon. There was always a top couple that created the world, you know, through their own procreation. Like fertility festivals were important. And so when the ancient Israelites did away with that, it didn't necessarily immediately do away with the divine feminine, although that certainly got buried quite a bit over the generations and didn't reemerge again until modern feminism. But because of the language issue and it just defaulting to masculine is how then the medieval rabbis come to think of God as a man.
Okay.
So, yeah, that's Vayashev. Everyone be nice to their siblings this Thanksgiving and Hanukkah. Don't throw anyone into a pit, even if they start talking politics at the dinner table. You know, wear your fanciest holiday outfits. I'm wearing my happy yarmulke shirt today, saving my new Hanukkah sweater for next Sunday. So
Lovely.
what?
It's lovely.
All right, I'll see you all next week.
Thank you.
Rabbi.
Thanks, Rabbi.
Bye.